Hello, I'm Renee Adams, Professor of Finance at Saïd Business School at the University of Oxford. Welcome to our 25th live webinar in the series, Leadership in Extraordinary Times. The series was created by the school as part of our response to the current pandemic. For those of you who want to follow along later, recordings of the series are available on our website and the school YouTube channel. Let me tell you how the event will be structured. We'll have some opening statements and some debate, with time for audience questions at the end. So please use the chat function on whatever platform you are watching and indicate who the question is for. The question in front of us is, should corporate leaders manage their companies for all their stakeholders or just their shareholders? In the tradition of an Oxford debate, I would like you to indicate your answer to this question now and at the end of the debate. So there'll be two polls on this question. For this first round, voting will close in 3 minutes. To put some context on the debate, I think it is important to note that there really is nothing to talk about when the interests of shareholders and stakeholders are aligned. So this debate really only makes sense if there is a tension. In a 2011 paper, my co-authors Amir Licht, Lila Sagiv, and I set out to investigate whether directors themselves perceive a tension between shareholderism, as we defined it, and stakeholderism. We found that director stances towards shareholders and stakeholders can be mapped onto an ideological continuum with shareholders on one side and stakeholders on the other. So what this evidence suggests that indeed there is a need to fight it out. So I am delighted today to have two experts who have written extensively on this subject to represent the two polar extremes of this ideological continuum and to make their case for the answers to the question. Our protagonists are Professor Lucian Bebchuk of the Harvard Law School and Professor Colin Meyer, CBE, of Saïd Business School. Lucian is Professor of Law, Economics, and Finance and the Director of the Corporate Governance Program at Harvard. Colin is a Peter Moores Professor of Management Studies at Saïd Business School and academic lead of the British Academy Future of the Corporation Program. Lucian, you have the floor.
You're on mute, Lucian.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Delighted to be here. I'll be speaking for the proposition that corporate leaders should not serve many masters and therefore should not serve the interests of all stakeholders. The presentation is based on joint work that I did with Roberto Tallarita, The Illusory Promise of Stakeholder Governance. Anyone who is interested, the work will be published later this year, but is already available online. Now, it's important to start by distinguishing between two versions of stakeholderism. One version is instrumental stakeholderism, and that means that corporate leaders should pay close attention to stakeholder interest, but they should do it only because doing so would in the end serve long-term shareholder value. And this version, as you can readily tell, is not really conceptually different from shareholder value maximization. The other version that is practically more meaningful, and that's the version that Professor Mayer will defend, is one that treats stakeholder welfare as an independent end in itself, and that calls upon corporate leaders in the numerous situations in which there are trade-offs to aggregate and balance the interests of all stakeholders. Now, the view that I'm defending is one that I should stress takes very seriously the major externalities that modern companies impose on stakeholders, but it argues that reliance on corporate leaders is a counterproductive approach for addressing such concerns for two main reasons. First, that the benefits of stakeholderism are illusory. Stakeholderism should not be expected to produce material benefits for stakeholders. And secondly, not only that it won't produce material benefits, but that stakeholderism has real perils. Embracing it would impose substantial cost on shareholders, society at large, and the very stakeholders that it intends to support. Now, let me speak briefly about some rhetoric that has been around stakeholderism. Last summer, the Business Roundtable issued a statement on the purpose of the corporation, which was heralded as a historic milestone. They stated that we share a fundamental commitment to all our stakeholders and commit to deliver value to all of them. Now, we put forward in our paper detailed evidence pieced together from various documents and corporate documents and statements that indicates that the statement represented a public relations move rather than a commitment to bring about meaningful changes. But putting aside this statement, which I mentioned only because it did receive a great deal of attention, and turning to the merits of stakeholderism more generally, can it serve as a tool that would materially improve the welfare of stakeholders, as Professor Mayer believes? Our answer is no. In our written work, we show and provide evidence that, first of all, there is a robust link and significant alignment between the interests of corporate leaders and those of shareholders. This is not a perfect alliance. It's not a perfect alignment, and this is a problem that corporate governance scholars have wrestled with, but there is a significant alignment and a robust link. By contrast, no such link whatsoever exists between the interests of corporate leaders and those of stakeholders. And therefore, as a matter of economic logic, the logic of incentives, directors and CEOs have incentives not to protect stakeholders beyond what would be called for by shareholder value maximization. We also set out to test this no incentive conclusion by looking at past behavior of corporate leaders and trying to see what it teaches us. And we take the view that a good laboratory is provided by acquisitions of companies in the many states in the United States that adopted constituency statutes. Those are anti-takeover statutes that allow corporate leaders to take into account the interests of stakeholders when they consider an acquisition offer. They were adopted due to concerns that the interests of various stakeholders were sacrificed in the face of deal transactions. So we reviewed the terms and deal documents of a hand-collected data sets of over 100 acquisitions of public companies by private equity firms during the last 2 decades. And we look at private equity acquisitions because, as many of you know, because they move assets into the hands of people who have powerful incentives to maximize financial returns, it is reasonable to expect that they might have adverse effect on stakeholders. What did we find? For whom did corporate leaders bargain using the power that the statutes gave them? We found that corporate leaders used their bargaining power to obtain substantial benefits for shareholders in terms of larger premiums, as well as for corporate leaders themselves, both executives and directors. However, we found that corporate leaders made very little use of their bargaining power to benefit stakeholders. There is no evidence whatsoever of any protections for customers and suppliers. And even though there are some provisions regarding employees or local communities, the analysis indicates that those protections are generally cosmetic and or unenforceable. So for the last 2 decades, even though constituency statutes empowered corporate leaders to deliver benefits to stakeholders, they failed to do so. And we wonder, why should we rely on such discretion to produce stakeholder benefits in the future? Furthermore, that lack of benefits came with a significant cost, because although these anti-takeover statutes failed to benefit stakeholders, they did benefit corporate managers by increasing managerial insulation and slack. This is all under the existing incentives, and note that stakeholderists commonly advocate relying on corporate leaders without proposing major changes in the existing corporate structures. But in our work, we nonetheless go beyond those arguments and try to see whether if we combine stakeholderism with some major corporate reforms, we could produce incentives to protect stakeholders beyond what's useful for shareholders. And we showed that attempting to do so, attempting to provide adequate incentives to serve all stakeholders by changing either how corporate leaders are compensated and or how they are elected, would be both quite challenging and quite costly. I would be interested in hearing whether Professor Mayer has a way of providing incentives to serve all stakeholders that would be effective and not highly costly. Now, might stakeholderism not help, but also perhaps not hurt? Our answer is no. Acceptance of stakeholderism would not only fail to deliver benefits, but would in fact be counterproductive. 2 perils I want to put on the table for you. First, stakeholderism would increase the insulation of corporate leaders from shareholders and would make corporate leaders less accountable to anyone. Illusory stakeholder benefits have for long been used to justify reforms that insulate and entrench managers, such as anti-takeover statutes. And by making corporate leaders more insulated and less accountable to anyone, stakeholderism would benefit corporate leaders themselves, but no one else. It would increase managerial slack and underperformance to the detriment of shareholders, society, and stakeholders themselves. Secondly, stakeholderism presents a clear and present danger of chilling stakeholderism protecting reforms. It would do so by raising false expectations and hopes that corporate leaders on their own would protect stakeholders. And those false hopes might chill or delay meaningful governmental reforms to protect stakeholders in various ways we discuss in our work. And therefore, those who care about stakeholders should be clear-eyed about the illusory promise of stakeholderism, warn against placing hopes on it, and focus on meaningful governmental reforms. To illustrate, a recent joint statement by numerous academics sounds the alarm, says there is less than a decade left in which to address the catastrophic threat of climate change. And therefore, to all those who have a shared sense of urgency, now is the time to reform corporate governance. We strongly disagree, not because we are not worried about climate change, quite the contrary. for those with this shared sense of urgency, it would be a serious mistake to devote attention to corporate governance reforms rather than, say, carbon tax. Expecting the discretion of corporate leaders to contribute materially to saving the planet would undermine rather than advance meaningful efforts to do so. To conclude, those who take stakeholder interests seriously, as we do, should focus on real stakeholder protecting governmental reforms and should reject the illusory and costly promise of stakeholderism. Despite the appealing closing of stakeholderism, stakeholderism really is just a new form of a managerialism, a philosophy that sought to empower managers and insulate them, and which many corporate governance have come around to reject. So we should do with stakeholderism. Thanks, and to you, Colin.
Thank you very much, Lucian. Why does business exist? Why is it created? And what is it there to do? In other words, what's its purpose? Lucian has a simple answer: to make money. But that's not a purpose. It's a product of a purpose. It's not a purpose. The purpose of business is to do things that benefit us as customers, communities, and the natural world. It's there to help us to solve problems profitably. Lucian has just rehearsed an age-old repetition of a discussion about what companies do, can't do, are incentivized to do, and forced to do. It is how Lucian sees the world. But it isn't how the world is, should be, could be, or will be. It therefore tells us nothing about the subject of this debate. Should corporate leaders manage their firms for all their stakeholders or just their shareholders? Should they? Not do they? Start from the question of what we want them to do and work from there. We want them to solve our problems, to help get us out of pandemics, to avoid us getting into crises, to help protect, not destroy, our natural world. We want them to do it in a way that is commercially viable, profitable, and sustainable. So, of course, we want them to manage their firms for all their stakeholders, including their shareholders. It's not either or, it's both and. Stakeholders include shareholders. And of course, companies recognize the importance of stakeholders to them. Companies are not just responsible to the stakeholders who depend on them, they are also dependent on them. Lucian is simply confused between cause and effect. Making money comes from solving problems. Solving problems does not follow automatically from making money. Should companies be managed for all their stakeholders? For example, their employees, as well as their shareholders? Yes. Does this benefit their shareholders, as well as their employees? Yes. Satisfied employees cause superior financial performance. Should companies be managed only for their shareholders? No. Financially driven banks caused immense harm for their customers and societies in the financial crisis. As Simon Sinek describes in his brilliant TED Talk, all the largest and most successful companies, Microsoft, Apple, Google, Facebook, Alibaba, Johnson & Johnson, have one thing in common. They all know not just what they do and how they do it, but above all, why they do it, their purpose. They are some of the most purposeful companies in the world. Take Microsoft's purpose: to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. Or Google's: to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. Or Alibaba's: make it easy to do business anywhere in the world. Clear, precise, meaningful, and inspiring challenges. Have they delivered? Yes. Have they profited? Yes. Have they profited at the expense of others from producing problems as well as solutions? Most definitely yes. And that's precisely the problem with Lucian's preoccupation with profits and the proposition that companies should just be managed for their shareholders. Do we really want companies to maximize their share price so long as they do not break the law or regulation or suffer reputational damage as a consequence, even if this results in them polluting the environment, paying their employees less than living wages, producing addictive products, or avoiding paying taxes? Of course not. And that comes to the second part of a purposeful company: not profiting from producing problems. Do markets solve this? No. The most successful companies in the world are often so large they don't have competitors, as in several of the cases I've just mentioned. Even if they did, that would not solve the problem. That is a second confusion of cause and effect on the part of Lucian. Good markets do not make good firms. A competitive market of thieves makes better thieves. Instead, good firms make good markets. Think of financial markets, some of the most competitive markets in the world, and some of the worst performing firms during and after the financial crisis. And regulation on its own cannot solve this either. Regulation of banks was intensified after the financial crisis. But bank regulators quickly realized that banks were not changing their behavior because they had not changed their purposes, cultures, or values to make money. A third confusion of cause and effect. Lucian's view is just impose regulation and everything follows. In fact, impose regulation and avoidance follows. Good regulation does not make good firms. Britain has one of the most sophisticated regulations of utilities of any country in the world, and the worst performing utilities. Leakages and pollution in water, crowded, late and expensive trains, lack of investment in infrastructure. It excels in just two respects: returns to shareholders and egregious executive remuneration. Good regulation does not make good firms. Good firms make good regulation. But the consequence of Lucian's only shareholders matter thesis is much more serious than this. No one else matters in his world. That is precisely the mindset that has got us to the point where the environment is posing threats to our existence, our health, and natural world, where large swathes of society feel that they are treated as machines, and where they know full well that as soon as they can be replaced by machines, they will be. And where discrimination, exclusion, exploitation, and deception are acceptable so long as they make money for their shareholders. Black lives, poor lives, female lives, children's lives matter as customers, societies, employees, suppliers, investors, and shareholders in and to companies. But the greatest irony of all is that Lucian's view is bad for shareholders. Because, believe it or not, shareholders are humans too. They too are concerned about their survival, health, employment, and environment. They too care about their children and grandchildren. In other words, they are, of course, stakeholders as well as shareholders, interested not just in their wealth, but their welfare and well-being, and those of their families and communities. Leaders of companies therefore face precisely the impossible trade-offs that Lucian seeks to avoid by pursuing only shareholders matter policies. Purpose solves the problem for shareholders as well as stakeholders, because it says what a company is not there to do, as well as what it is there to do, what and whose problems it is not solving, as well as solving. Purpose limits the task. It specifies in whose interests is the company run, what its values are, and precisely the hard trade-offs it has to make in this pandemic crisis between its employees and customers and between its shareholders and societies. It simplifies and makes precise what the only shareholders matter idea leaves vague and confused. And it measures the performance of the firm against what matters for shareholders as well as stakeholders. Not only is the notion of purpose as solving the challenges we face commercially and profitably inspiring and motivational for all of us as stakeholders and shareholders, it's also the way of improving our lives as shareholders as well as citizens of the world. Lucian and I will now pose each other 3 questions, and I will begin by asking Lucian the first question. Lucian, so long as it was neither illegal nor socially unacceptable for them to do so, it would seem that, according to your thesis, directors of companies once had a duty to minimize costs and maximize profits by employing and trading slave labor. Is that correct, Lucian? And is it desirable?
No, that's not correct. And in fact, as you know, although you would like to change the system, our system has run in many countries under the principle of shareholder value maximization, and companies have not been doing the abhorrent things of the example that you mentioned. But going into it more broadly, I think that the distinction you draw between your view and my view is unwarranted. You draw the distinction between what we care about and what our values are. You care about solving the problems of the world, and myself, as well as a very long tradition in economics, cares only about the shareholders and money making. This is very far from my view, as I stressed a number of times throughout the presentation and numerous times in our work. We care deeply about stakeholder interest, and in fact, we support stakeholder favoring reforms in many areas, labor, inequality, climate change, that are probably on the more aggressive, drastic, progressive side of the spectrum. But even though we share your, we all, like you, want to make the world better off, so I think we should really put aside this distinction. The question is, what's the best way of getting there? In our view, which is part of a very long tradition, it goes back to Adam Smith, as you know, our view is that it might be better to make the managers accountable and focus on one clear objective, but face them with very substantial constraints and regulations that would make them internalize externalities. So we believe in this. We don't think regulation is a panacea, but we think that it far dominates the alternative which you support, because in your view, the way we would solve the world is to have the corporate leaders of each company wear the hat of the social planner or the social czar, take into account all the social interests of their choices and try to balance them, and do all of this magic without having any good and effective incentives to do so. We think it's not going to work, certainly much less than what we favor. And secondly, it's also going to produce real damage, because corporate leaders might end up using this discretion to serve their own private benefits rather than those of the stakeholders.
Okay, now, first of all, let me just point out, I'm sure you're aware of this fact, that modern slavery persists and child labor to this day, despite having been deemed to be illegal, and that regulation, as I was describing, in many areas has not provided anything like the panacea that you believe that it should do. Furthermore, your challenge in terms of what it is that we should do to incentivize companies to perform better, I've set out as being very straightforward. And that is that there's a basic underlying priority that should guide the incentive system for companies. They should not profit from producing problems for people or planet. We should measure profits in such a way that companies have to provide costs for remedying the extent to which they cause damage and the costs associated with cleaning that up. Now, if one comes to the example that I was actually talking about, in which I'm afraid you failed to completely answer, because as you're well aware, actually, companies operated in exactly the way that I was just describing, in terms of pursuing profits before there were laws that prevented them from doing so, or that there was a social prohibition by employing slave labor. Now, had we gone back 300-400 years and had what I set out as a very basic presumption as to how we should be measuring profit, slave labor and the trading of slave labor would never have arisen, simply because it would not have been permissible or would not have been profitable to have done it. Unfortunately, because you are in a position where you're saying we should not try and predict how governments are going to react, we are going to make repeated mistakes of the same sort. For example, in relation to the way in which we allow artificial intelligence to take over our lives in the future. Of course, we have to be predictive of what happens. Of course, we have to expect companies to anticipate as far as they possibly can what are the likely negative consequences of what they're going to do, as well as the profitable outcomes. And they have to make provisions for that in the way in which they would want to make provisions against any risks that they themselves incur. I'll come and I'll ask you a second question, as you don't seem to be asking me questions. Do you think that companies should have produced ventilators and retained their employees during the current crisis, even if this caused them to cut their dividends and reduce their share prices and long-term financial performance as a consequence?
The answer is yes. And indeed, companies have been racing both to produce ventilators and to invest in vaccines. And those are companies which, happy to go over the documents with you, those are companies that provide their executives and the directors incentives that are largely stock-based. Now, let me respond to your broader challenge, and then I'll ask a question. So I'm glad that you are here suggesting a practical way of implementing incentives that would get directors to do the right thing in a world in which stakeholderism is happening. And this, by the way, and that's important to note, is not something that most of the advocates of stakeholderism have done. So we have looked at the executive pay arrangements of all the business roundtable signatories. They don't have such arrangements. We have looked at many other things. So we have looked at many writings. But so I commend you for proposing this. And let's look at this. You are saying, why don't we, when company pollutes, we measure this and tie the compensation of the managers to the cost of pollution. Okay, this assumes that we can measure this cost well, which I'm happy to assume. But in this case, I would strongly prefer government regulation that imposes this cost on the company and lets it run. And the reason is that when we studied the possibility of compensation based on ESG, we found that it would be very problematic, because you'll ask, who is going to design the compensation scheme that is measuring compensation and ties it to pollution? We all know how big a problem we had with executive compensation, even when we were focusing just on shareholder value, and people were concerned that managers might use compensation to line their own pockets. So
okay, well, let me just explain to you
sure.
how one would do this. And firstly, let me just come back to your question, the question I posed to you. If they cut their dividends and reduce their long-term financial performance and share prices, they are violating the notion that they are pursuing shareholder interests. It's not a question of trading off the present for the future. They are simply making their shareholders worse off. Now, according to you, they shouldn't be engaging in that type of trade-off. But let me explain how companies are actually dealing with this problem, and I'll give you an illustration of a company that is doing it in a very straightforward way. Microsoft has indicated it is going to go carbon zero in relation to its phase 1 and phase 2 CO2 emissions, and it's going to go carbon zero in relation to the phase 3. Now, what that is saying is that they have a clear set of metrics by which they are going to measure whether or not they are achieving a reduction in CO2. They set out the expenditures that are required to do that, and then they measure their performance against it. And to the extent that they're failing to do it, then they have to provide for the costs of ensuring that they rectify that damage. And that is all that's required. It doesn't require you to make valuations of harm. It's a matter of saying, what are the metrics that indicate whether or not harm or good is being done, and then to provide for the costs of cleaning that up. But let me just ask you.
Let me maybe just respond to this and also ask you my question. So putting aside Microsoft, in our paper, we actually looked at a significant number of companies and looked at what they had in their compensation arrangements. And we have since then expanded this a great deal. And what we find is that by and large, when metrics are used, they are used in a cosmetic and limited fashion. And more importantly, they are used in a way that outsiders cannot scrutinize them effectively to see whether this is done to enable managers to make more money. If you come to Microsoft,
you have to ask your question because we're running out of time.
Oh, okay. So my question is the following. It seems to me that the evidence that we presented, and I briefly summarized, with respect to private equity transactions, speaks directly to the potential effects of what you would like to see. So basically, 20 years ago in the US, people had the problem that employees and others had adverse effects like firing as a result of hostile takeovers. They adopted legal rules, not just conventions, legal rules that explicitly gave managers the power to take interest into account with the motivation, with the intention of protecting stakeholders. After 20 years, we see that this was used for the private benefits of managers, these entrenched managers, but it didn't produce any benefits for stakeholders. Doesn't that give you at least some pause
Not in
before
the
advocating doing it more generally?
Not in the slightest, because as you well know, the US is a system in which there is essentially one of the most pro-shareholder systems in the world. The fact that one observes companies who are coming into states that offer potential protection to stakeholders and still are able to deliver outcomes that are basically beneficial for the acquirers is bound to yield outcomes that are detrimental to the stakeholders. What makes sense is to think about how do you actually change the system in such a way that companies as a whole are putting their purpose first. Now, you actually have a law in the US that could be a model for doing that based on the Public Benefit Corporation. If one in essence had that operating, then those provisions that you're talking about in the constituency states would, of course, be effective because the acquiring companies would have to demonstrate how their purpose is consistent with not doing damage to the
But almost no public companies have opted into this law.
And they are now beginning to do exactly that in terms of Danone being the first major publicly listed company to do that. We are going to see, as companies realize the importance of the issues that the pandemic crisis are raising, not just for the environment, but now also for society. We are going to see more and more companies moving in this direction, and that is precisely what we want to see. I think we, at this stage, are supposed to hand back to René, please, to ask us some questions from the audience.
Yes, but first I'm going to jump into the fray. So we gave the audience a chance to give their views, and it seems only fair that we also give directors a chance to express their views. So what I have on this slide is some evidence that I referred to earlier, where we asked directors what their view is on the shareholder versus stakeholder debate. And what this slide shows is a histogram of their views. And so if you're over here at 6, you're pro-shareholder, and over here at 1, you're pro-stakeholder. All right, so these are directors from listed companies around the world. And what you clearly see here is most directors actually fall right smack in the middle, right? The mass is in the middle. And let me just show you some comparison here. So that was the full sample. It was 23 countries. And what we have here is the US, the very shareholder-oriented US. And you see a very similar picture, right? So a lot of the mass here is in the middle. And here we have the UK. So we have some of the tail is missing, but also I should say that the sample is relatively small. Okay, so I put up this data, and now I would like to ask both of you a question. So I'll start with you, Colin. So if we look at this data, are we just talking, you saw that most of the mass was in the middle. So directors are not uniformly on the pro-shareholder side. So are we just talking here about a few bad apples?
No, we're not talking about a few bad apples. We're talking about exactly results that I would have expected to have observed from this. In fact, your slide shows that the UK, if anything, is more pro-shareholder than the US. It's indicative of the fact that there is a wide disparity. So what you are picking up is that there are some companies that are highly stakeholder oriented, and there are some companies that are highly shareholder oriented. Now, the problem that arises is that the influence of that pro-shareholder group in a system in which there is a free market for corporate control or hedge fund activism undermines the ability of those who are pro-stakeholder to be able, or pro-purpose as I put it, to be able to actually implement it. And that means that in effect, and this is exactly the result that Lucian is basically finding in his study, that even in constituency states, if you have that notion of an active market underpinning what companies can do, that drives companies, even though they want to be pro-stakeholder, in a direction where they basically have to be pro-shareholder.
So Lucian, what would you say about this? So, the fact we basically, we observe that the law doesn't seem to matter so much, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that directors are not pro-stakeholder.
Yes, it's a financial, with due respect to directors, who are a very important set of people. As a financial economist, what matters most to me and is most telling is not what directors say in surveys, but what they do, okay? And what they do, in our paper, we have a lot. What they do is that when they make decisions when to sell the company, they actually show when it really matters that they use all their power to benefit shareholders and executives and themselves, and don't use this power to benefit stakeholders. They agree to have the company go along with the business roundtable statement, but we show through various corporate documents that they are basically operating under the assumption that this is really a public relations move rather than commitment to meaningful change. Now, why would corporate leaders, when asked, say things like that? Same reason why the Business Roundtable made this statement. It sounds very good. It gets you points, sometimes with public opinion. And it provides you with some degree of insulation. When shareholders, when institutional investors are complaining about underperformance, you might say, look, part of it is because we are focusing on long-term effect of stakeholders. So one, there are some reasons to doubt what we learn from what corporate leaders say. And there are a lot of reasons to look at what they do, and what they do speaks very loudly that we cannot expect them to protect stakeholders with power that is given to them for this purpose.
Okay, so yeah, so we didn't just ask people what they think, right? So we were a bit cleverer than that. I highly recommend reading the paper, because I think it's a bit more informative than it may be, than it may appear. But now let's turn over to the audience, and I'm going to first ask a question to Colin. Could Colin please explain how he would explain to shareholders that he was not interested in maximizing profits?
Colin is extremely interested in the returns to shareholders by pointing out that it's a primary purpose of companies to deliver profitable solutions. And so that what we're looking to do here is exactly what I was setting out, recognizing that this is and this is what the debate is all about. Who should companies be managing their companies for? Should they be managing them just for their shareholders? My answer is no. They should be managing them for their stakeholders and their shareholders. Why? Because if they promote the interests of their stakeholders, that actually delivers a better outcome for the company. And in many cases, not necessarily in all cases, that it gives rise to greater returns to shareholders. And if it's the case that, for example, one can deliver tremendous social benefits in this pandemic through shifting production towards social goods, even if it reduces shareholder value in the long term. And I'm afraid Lucian never answered this question, because according to the shareholder primacy, you simply cannot do that. What I'm saying is, if you lose a small amount, even in the long term from shareholders, there may be vast compensating benefits for stakeholders, which justify even that type of action. But for in general, what we're talking about here are things that are profitable for shareholders as well.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you a question, Lucian, but before I do that, can I remind everyone that there will be another round of polling so we can see whether people's opinions changed. And now, Lucian, let me ask you this question, which is government regulation is known to be, in quotation marks, responsive to big business. In the end, it's what big companies want. How does shareholderism overcome this?
What overcomes this is not a shareholderism, but an effort on the people who deeply care about stakeholders. For example, about climate change or inequality or labor, requires mobilization to get something that would work. Sure, there are some uphill struggles, but our point is that there is really no other way, that relying on corporate leaders to produce this outcome, which is actually in your question, you were mentioning that it's exactly corporate leaders who lobby against such regulations. So relying on corporate leaders to take care of the externalities is not going to work. So we have to be clear-eyed about it. And it's not going to be easy. And I want to stress, it's not a panacea, but it's the only game in town, and we have to be clear-eyed about it. And I want to mention just one quick thing about what Colin just said. And there is a big disagreement between us on this last point. Colin generally says that he doesn't support the instrumental stakeholderism when you do it just to benefit long-term shareholder value. But what he was saying just now was saying, look, practically speaking, most of the time, doing what's good for the stakeholders is also good for the shareholders. And here we have a basic fundamental disagreement about the state of the world. And here I would assert, and we don't have time to debate this, that most economists would agree with me that trade-offs are ubiquitous. We have trade-offs right and left. Sure, there are some things that are good for stakeholders and for shareholders, treating your customers well, and we can expect this to happen anyway, under your view, under my view. But there are numerous instances when there are real trade-offs, and therefore your side of the debate should not invoke the assumption that most of the time what's good for stakeholders is good for business.
All right, so we're running out of time, so I will ask two more questions, and hopefully we can keep the answers short so you each get a chance. So to Colin, should managers of large companies or even only public companies be elected by the general public? This arguably would internalize the interests of all stakeholders into managers' consideration.
No, it does not require all directors to be elected by all the public. It can still involve directors being, as they are, elected now by their shareholders, but under the understanding that the duties of their directors are to promote their corporate purposes. And to come back to Lucian's point about the ubiquitous trade-offs, it is precisely where those trade-offs are difficult that one needs to have a clear notion of a corporate purpose that determines how directors should be making those trade-offs. And precisely the problem that arises in the context of the shareholder primacy view, and is set out quite explicitly in their paper, is that they don't want directors to have to make those sort of trade-off decisions. Directors are making them all the time. And one of the primary issues that Lucian has failed to address is that even within the shareholder class, There is a wide divergence of view as to what they want companies to do. And directors have to make a trade-off in terms of long-term versus short-term, in terms of promoting impact investing, because some of their investors want to have their well-being rather than their wealth maximized. And those sorts of trade-offs within the shareholder model simply do not have any guidance to them. Within what I'm talking about as purposeful companies, there's a clear notion of measuring your performance against that purpose, setting out the metrics, demonstrating how you're delivering on them, and thereby having a mechanism for ensuring that you are reflecting the trade-offs in the minds of shareholders as well as in the minds of stakeholders. It is the only practical approach. What Lucian is describing is entirely impractical. And the notion that it's simply stakeholder notions that are giving rise to the distortions with government, that is simply undermined by what one observes in the US and the extensive lobbying that goes on of government policy. Just look at financial regulation and how that was diminished in the face of lobbying by banks. It is simply a mistake to think that purpose of this sort creates problems. It is a way of solving exactly the sorts of problems that Lucian is pointing to.
So Lucian, maybe quick, your choice, quick response to Colin to end up.
Sure.
Another
Sure.
question.
Sure, quick response. On the voting issue, I think there is a tension in Colin's view, because if he believes that all stakeholders should be taken into effect and the board should respond to all of them, then the natural step is to give voting power to all of them, because as long as only the shareholders have voting power, there is a fundamental tension. You have only one group that votes on the directors and set their compensation, and you expect the directors to balance interests. On the lobbying, I agree, it's a big problem, but that's just more of a reason not to expect that the corporate leaders that Colin is concerned about their lobbying will use their discretion in order to protect the interest that regulation is supposed or is trying to address. If they do not, if they try to oppose ferociously regulation, they presumably would also not use their discretion to benefit stakeholders. Thanks a lot.
All right, thank you to both of you. And we now have a new poll with results that will be showing up soon. Please don't forget to vote. So all their shareholders, if I see this, so blue bar is clearly higher. Now, could we see the previous results? All right, so stakeholders win. Now it's not entirely clear. Okay, actually, it looks like we have more shareholder orientation than at the beginning, if I'm reading this correctly. So Lucian, you're our guest, and it's you know, it seems that you've persuaded some people to your side during the course of this debate. So I guess with that, I'd like to thank everyone who participated in putting this event together. Of course, most importantly, thank our two participants who debated and tried to fight out this issue. I think it's probably clear we have not resolved this question. There were many questions that the audience submitted, excellent questions that we couldn't get to. So it seems clear that there will be ongoing debates for a while. So thanks very much, everyone, for attending, participating, and thinking, most importantly, for thinking about these very important issues.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you very much, René. Thank you, Lucian.
Thanks a lot, Colin and René, and thanks for everyone for being here.